Hello, I'm back. We're going to be reading some more Hitler's Wonderland by Michael Fry. Not last week, it was just yesterday. We read about the Reichstag fire. We read about, what's going on with OBS? It says no data. Hi, Angela. Oh, now it's 0. Maybe I can try changing servers. I don't know. I mean, my connection is just absolute garbage, so I don't know if changing servers will help. Yeah, my bit rate. You know, I pay for the. I've complained about this a million times before. I pay for the best internet plan offered in my area, and it's just garbage. Like, downloading speeds are really good, but I don't know. When I do a speed test, the upload speed is at like 50 megabytes or whatever, which I think is supposed to be good. But then once I hit go live, it all just goes to shit. So, I don't know. But it still says 0% drop frames, so I'm just going to go with it. But anyway, yesterday we talked about the Reichstag fire. We talked about the, Hitler declaring war on the communists and the reforms he made on the labor market with the labor force and the the other stuff, whatever, with the trade unions, And then we talked about what Michael Fry called Nazi terrorism, which the title of that chapter was a little misleading because he did give them kind of a fair look. He said, they did this stuff. A lot of people just were kind of arrested and then quote unquote resisted arrest and were shot in the process. But he compared that to other revolutions and said, well, it really wasn't that bad. Maybe 500 people died, and that's nothing compared to the French Revolution or something like that. So that's kind of the conclusion he came to. It was bad, but it was also not as bad as it could have been. And today, we're going to talk about, hang on, let me pull this up. And we're going to talk about the Jewish question. Oh boy. So we're going to do the next 2 chapters, I think, today, because I did work today and I work tomorrow, so it'll be a little shorter. But it'll be about 30 pages total. A little more than 30. I think it was 33 when I looked. But we're starting with this one. I think this one's a little bit longer. It's about 20 pages, and the next one's kind of the standard chapter length that we've seen in the past. So we'll just get into it. This Jewish question, chapter 7. Do you mean that you think you can find out the answer to it? Said the March Hare. Stormtroop brutality directed against communists is not very difficult to understand, but Hitler's anti-Semitism remains. To the average person, inexplicable. Anti-Semitism in general is a problem that has existed for hundreds of years. In AD 1290, we already find King Edward I expelling the Jews from England because, quote, they ate the English nation to the bone, end quote. To the case of modern Germany, the most bewildering part of the question is that articles and books written by Jews or pro-Semitic Christians only present the Jews' point of view, whereas anything published by the German government gives the Nazis' exaggerated version. A writer's own race is so often an influential factor in his arguments. It would be interesting to read a book on the Jewish question written by neither a Christian nor a Jew, but by a member of an entirely different race, a Chinaman, for instance. In the meantime, the Jewish question stands as one of the strongest barriers between Hitler and the rest of the world. a misunderstanding which has had the most distressing effect on international peace and cooperation. While the average Nazi appears to understand the problem of Aryans and non-Aryans thoroughly, the people outside Germany are attempting to explain these unfamiliar terms. According to one school of anthropologists, the name Aryas or Aryan is given to the oldest ancestors of the Indo-European races. The Aryans lived in Turkestan in the valley of the Oxus River, now called the Amudarya or Jihun River, the land which runs from the Pear Plateau down to Lake Aral and which is now part of Russia. Some of the ancient Aryans went to settle in India. They spoke Sanskrit and were called Hindus. Others settled in Iran, spoke a language called Zend, and were called Iranians. Subsequent comparisons made between European languages and Sanskrit or Zend shows that the Celts, the Greeks, the Latins, the Germans, and the Slavs all have a common Aryan origin. Semites, on the other hand, include all the races whose language was either Aramaic, Syrian, Chaldaic, Hebrew, Arabic, or Assyrian, and the original race of Semites was said to have been founded by Sem, who was one of Noah's many sons. Now, according to Count de Gobineau, an eminent French anthropologist, the different races of the world were unequal. At the summit was the Aryan race, composed of tall, blonde, dolichocephalics, long heads, while much lower in the scale came the brachycephalics, the round heads. Gobineau explains history as a constant duel between dolichocephalics and brachycephalics, and this theory was further developed by one of his disciples, Vacher de la Puge, also a Frenchman, Leopold von Ranke, a German historian, and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, an Englishman. Gobineau's theory of race, inequality, and Aryan superiority is open to criticism. That his theory may have had some foundation a few thousand years ago is possible, but the ceaseless mixing of races that took place in the course of time makes it extremely difficult to point to any one race without fear of including several others. Nazis are fond of pointing to the Germans and saying, "There is an example of a perfect Aryan Nordic race," and some Jews are equally enamored of the idea that the Jewish race is the purest in existence. Both of them are quite wrong. The Germans are a mixture of many races, just as the Jews are far from being all they claim. Quote, "For many years, the Jews posed as a race that had remained pure from all contamination, but about 25 years ago, a serious study was undertaken to determine the elements of which the Jewish race is composed. The astounding result of this research has been to prove that the Jew, instead of being a pure race, is one of the most mixed races in existence. We learned that the mixture began thousands of years ago." End quote. And that's from L'Esprit Juif by Maurice Murray. I sound nervous and sweaty? No? Both Count de Gobineau and Leopold von Ranke agree that the Semites belong to the mulatto class, which resulted from the crossing of the white and black races at a very early period in history, at least 2,000 years before Christ. This crossing apparently took place in Arabia, making that country, and not Palestine, the real home of the Jews. Therefore, without going any further in this anthroposociological discussion, it may be taken for granted that neither the German nor the Jew are of pure race, and that the question of Aryan superiority is open to a great deal of criticism. But on one point, everyone has agreed Aryans and Jews are different, as different morally as they are racially, and that is the first key to Hitler's anti-Semitism. The Nazis should not cry, "We are the cream of the earth, but the Jews are low creatures." The real slogan could only be, "Germany for the Germans, therefore out with the Jews because they are not Germans." The difference is certainly not religious, because whether the Jew knows it or not, there is no prejudice against him in the Christian churches because of his religion. On the contrary, the average Christian feels a deep sense of indebtedness to the Jew, for he feels that he shares with him in his religion. The real difference lies in the spiritual field. The German is the idealist and the Jew is the materialist. The Jew has never been anything else since the days of Moses' annoyance at the worship of the golden calf. While the Nordics and the Slavs were spending valuable time fighting for ideas, sociological, eugenic, or religious, the Jew is quietly but progressively making money and developing his business interests. "Let the Gentiles amuse themselves with Luther, Robespierre, and Napoleon," said the Jew. "But as for me, increased turnover is what I'm after." At the same time, the Jew was not concerned with new ideas for himself, because so far as he was concerned, his own house was in order, and all he had to do was to carry on a policy of conservatism in order to retain his moral and religious homogeneity. While the people of Europe were busy with religious reform, government reform, social reform, and so on, the Jews had all their time free to buy a little here and sell a little there, with the obvious result that already in the Middle Ages, the Jews gained a material hold over the industrial, agricultural, and financial side of the various countries in which they had established themselves. And that is one of the things that annoyed Hitler most. In his autobiography, he wrote, quote, he, the Jew, gradually establishes himself in the economic life of his hosts, not as a producer, but as a middleman. In a short time, on usurious interest, he has become completely established, i.e., he settles in particular quarters of towns and builds up more and more estate within estate. He considers commerce, as well as all money lending, as his own privileged specialty. End quote. Hitler cannot understand why the Jew should be allowed to skim the cream off industry, commerce, and finance in Germany, when in reality he was not even a German. He cannot tolerate the existence of a state within a state, because to him it was a danger to the welfare of the German nation, not so much a material danger, because he had to admit that the materialistic activities of the Jews contributed largely to the Reich's prosperity, but a moral danger, a danger to German and consequently Christian morality and idealism. That is the second key to Hitler's anti-Semitism. It is based on the plausible theory that the Jews really hate the Christians and would be only too pleased to destroy them. When one considers that less than 2,000 years ago, Judaism was the supreme religion in the Near East, and that because of the growth of Christianity, it fell into disrepute, one is tempted to think that the Jews are perhaps justified in disliking the Christians, when at the same time, history shows how badly the Jews were treated by the Christians for centuries, how at one period of European history, Jews were considered social pariahs and subjected to endless persecution. One is still more inclined to sympathize with the Jews' desire for revenge. How this revenge was to be obtained is not clear. It obviously had to be fought for on moral ground, and so, according to Hitler, the Jews have been doing everything in their power to destroy the foundations of Christianity in order to bring the whole edifice crashing to the ground in ruins upon which the world will be rebuilt according to the Talmud and not the Holy Gospel. Where Hitler got this idea is difficult to say, but my own theory, which was substantiated by a talk with one of Hitler's personal adjutants, is that Hitler read the famous document known as the Protocols of the Wise Men of Zion before writing his chapter on the Jews in the book Mein Kampf. And there's a footnote on the protocols. It says, this document has been ascribed to the Jew Asher Ginsburg and is purported to have been written between 1880 and 1890. The protocols were first published in Russia in 1901, but did not cause any real controversy until 20 years later in 1921. The document gave a detailed account of the Jews' plans for the destruction of Christianity and subsequent world domination. No sooner was it published in Europe and America than flaming articles appeared in all the newspapers denying the authenticity of the document, and the fight became worldwide. Eventually, after the document had been ascribed to the Russian Tsarist police and several other sources, the weighty opinion of the Times, issues of August 16th, 17th, and 18th of 1921, was that the protocols were a forgery. The controversy gradually subsided until the present day, when the Nazis' violent anti-Semitism is beginning to revive the world's interest in the Jewish question. And speaking of banned books, the protocols are another one that you can't really find anywhere. That won't be on the Barnes & Noble shelf. I can tell you that. We'll continue on. Leaving aside the question of the document's authenticity, we will imagine Hitler reading the following extracts from the Protocols of the Wise Men of Zion. In the hands of the states of, this is a quote, in the hands of the states of today, there is a great force that creates the movement of thought in the people, and that is the press. The part played by the press is to keep pointing out requirements supposed to be indispensable, to give voice to the complaints of the people, to express and to create discontent. This discontent will be still further magnified by the effects of an economic crisis, which will stop dealing on the exchanges and bring industry to a standstill. We, the Jews presumably, shall create by all the methods open to us with the aid of gold, which is in all our hands, a universal economic crisis whereby we shall throw upon the streets whole mobs of workers simultaneously in all the countries of Europe. There's a footnote here that says, even allowing that the document is a forgery, the fact that it was first published in 1901, long before the world crisis, makes it amazingly prophetic. And we'll continue on. These mobs will rush delightedly to shed the blood of those whom, in the simplicity of their ignorance, they have envied from their cradles, and those whose property they will then be able to loot. Ours they will not touch, because the moment of attack will be known to us. We shall take measures to protect our own. In order that the masses themselves may not guess what it is all about, we further distract them with amusements, games, pastimes, passions, people's palaces. Soon we shall begin through the press to propose competitions in art and sport of all kinds. In countries known as progressive and enlightened, we will create a senseless, filthy, abominable literature. End quote. An argument I've always heard about the protocols is that it doesn't really matter if it's a forgery, if it's happening anyway. And I don't know about the whole Jewish conspiracy angle, but it definitely seems to be something that's definitely happening, regardless of what the source actually is. What the source is, I'll leave to your imagination. One can imagine Hitler's feelings after reading the protocols when he realized that the powerful German press, the Ulstein and Rudolf Moss concerns, was controlled by Jews, that the economic crisis was a reality, and that the militant leaders of communism were many of them Jews. Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Radek, Erich Musam, etc., using the discontent of the masses to attack the state and religion. That Germany was being swamped with filthy, abominable literature for which the Jews were largely responsible, that in the big cities the Jews had captured most of the key positions. He did not need to verify the authenticity of the protocols. He merely exclaimed, like Henry Ford had done in 1921, quote, "The only statement I care to make about the protocols is that they fit in with what is going on. They are 16 years old, and they have fitted the world situation up to this time. They fit it now." End quote. That is a plausible explanation of Hitler's anti-Semitism. Germany for the Germans became the slogan of the Nazi Party, and Germany is governed by Jews, down with the Jews. Seeing these slogans, one might suppose that Hitler did not originally declare his anti-Semitism on racial or eugenic grounds, as his supporters are doing at the moment, but that this whole war was waged with the idea of preventing the Jews from influencing the minds of 65 million Aryans. Racially, the Aryan population was not in a very great danger because the total number of Jews in the Reich was not higher than 500,000, but the way in which a small number of Jews had managed to gain control of the nation's industrial, commercial, and intellectual resources is what caused Hitler grave misgivings. In the first place, the Jews concentrated in the cities. Out of every 1,000 Jews, 750 lived in the larger towns: Magdeburg, Altona, Hamburg, Berlin, Breslau, Frankfurt am Main were the most popular centers. They concentrated on the liberal professions, leaving the Nordics to do the bread-earned-by-sweat-of-brow work. In Berlin, for instance, 1,850 out of 3,400 lawyers were Jews, 54%. The faculty of medicine in the university had 50%. Jewish professors, the faculty of philosophy, had 25%. 50% of the medical doctors were Jews. 40% of the dentists were Jews. Berlin law court judges were 23% Jews. As for the entertainment industry, Germany was no exception to the worldwide monopoly of the Jews in the film, theater, restaurant, nightclub, and allied trades. The name of Kempinski, Germany's Super Lions and Company, is at the top of the tree for entertainment and people's palaces. In Berlin's commerce, the list of owners of huge department stores reads like a page of the Jewish who's who. Wertheim, on the style of Selfridges in London and Macy's in New York. Tietz, a huge department store. Karstadt, in the New Köln district, a monster store. Israel, another big department store. In industry, one outstanding example of Jewish control was the Kriegsmetall Aktiengesellschaft, War Metals Limited, where the board of directors was composed of 12 Jews out of 14 directors. The big press concerns, as I mentioned before, were Jewish-owned Ulstein, Lockman, Moss, and the two largest. Editors of the hundreds of publications by these firms included Messrs. Rabalski, Mendel, Bernstein, Loeb, Wolf, Stein, Goldstein, Einstein, and Sinsheimer, to mention only a few. Foreign correspondents of the Ulstein Group were L. Stahl in Paris, R. Louison in London, E. Wallenberg in New York, J. Birnbaum in Warsaw, and W. Stein in Moscow. According to Nazis, non-Aryans should not have the opportunity of molding the thoughts of 60 million Aryans. For that reason, the entire German press is now under the control of the propaganda ministry, whose head is Aryan Minister Goebbels. The press dictatorship started most of the trouble. Jewish journalists who found themselves out of a job crossed the frontiers and began firing at Hitler through the columns of foreign newspapers. When Hitler dismissed Jewish judges from the law courts, cut the number of Jewish lawyers in Berlin from 1850 to 35, dismissed the Jews from the civil service, state hospitals, and education boards, the outcry was loudest: persecution of the Jews, inhuman treatment of Jews by Hitler, etc., with the usual headlines. Hitler retaliated by threatening to start a nationwide Jewish boycott if the foreign press did not tone down its vituperation. The reply was still larger headlines. The outcome was that on April 1st, 1933, April Fool's Day, the Third Reich declared an open boycott against the Jews for one day, with the possibility of prolongation. Action committees were established to make a list of the Jewish shops, which were then picketed by stormtroopers from 10 in the morning until 8 o'clock that night. Small posters bearing yellow spots on a black ground were pasted on the windows of shops belonging to Jews. Slogans were, "Don't buy from Jewish stores," "Don't patronize Jewish lawyers," "Avoid Jewish doctors." A counterattack was tried by some Jewish shops in London by posting up bills, "Boycott German goods," but this attempt was discouraged by the police. The Jewish boycott only lasted one day. The international press put on the soft pedal, and there was a temporary lull in hostilities. This truce was only apparent because since April 1933 to this day, Jews all over the world have organized an enormously powerful boycott against Germany. Quote, "The statesmanship of Jewish self-defense is not to be understood in the language of armies and navies," said a prominent Jew in New York. "It does not even depend on diplomatic negotiations. Our self-defense rests entirely upon our ability to awaken public opinion in our behalf and upon our power to use practical instrument of economic pressure." End quote. That's from the Jewish Daily Bulletin, February 21st, 1934. Anyone conversant with international economics will agree that a small number of Jews all over the world control an enormous amount of the world's wealth. They are, therefore, in an advantageous position to bring economic pressure to bear on Germany in revenge for Nazi persecution of Jews. To stress the pitiful defenselessness of the chosen people is to show an equally pitiful ignorance of international finance and its ramifications throughout the world. After the one-day boycott in April 1933, the government began to make a wholesale cleanup of non-Aryans in government offices, schools, and professions, during which time stormtroopers again showed their ruffian characters by persecuting a number of unfortunate Jews from the ghettos. Hitler's contention that important positions in the German Empire should be held by Aryan Christians has some measure of fairness in it, but the deliberate maltreatment of some very poor Jew whose only sin against the nation was his crooked nose is inexcusable. The little Cohen who keeps a second-hand clothes shop in the Dragonerstrasse has never heard of the protocols. He ekes out a miserable existence, plying some small trade, lives in filthy slums for perhaps 60 years, and then dies without leaving a trace of his passing. But once again, the edicts of the leaders were vulgarized by their minions. As it was in the case of communists and social democrats, the government dealt with the men at the top, while their underlings attempted to emulate the leaders by punishing insignificant individuals of the rank and file. If I may be allowed to guess at the type of Jew who was persecuted by stormtroopers, I would say over 80% of them came from the ghetto, inoffensive little Semites who invariably made excellent German citizens. Hitler never meant to attack that kind of Jew, nor can documentary proof be supplied to make him responsible for the beatings which took place in the Sturmlokalen in the dead of night. The kind he disliked were men responsible for the lewd literature, Jews who were active executives in the Communist Party. Others who owned chains of brothels and vice dens and were connected with the worldwide drug ring, graft engineers like the brothers Scleric, unscrupulous speculators in finance and agriculture, Jews who were dishonest company promoters and wholesale swindlers, intellectual Jews who tried, by various means, to destroy either patriotism or moral restraint, Jewish theater and film magnates with their ceaseless stream of sexy entertainment. These were the Jews Hitler was attempting to extirpate from Germany, and for that no one can blame him without openly siding with immorality and corruption, sometimes referred to as advanced thought. Therefore, Nazi anti-Semitism and its origin was not directed against the Jews, but against certain Jews. The proof of this is that there are still hundreds of Jews in Germany today who continue to occupy important positions in the country's economic life. One of the present directors of the Deutsche Bank und Diskonto Gesellschaft is a Jew. But whereas a worldwide outcry is made on behalf of those who are either persecuted or expelled, nothing is said of the hundreds of thousands of Jews who have remained in Germany and managed to carry on their existence as before. Nevertheless, Hitler deserves a certain amount of criticism for the indiscriminate way in which certain intellectual Jews were either deprived of their means of subsistence or directly banished from Germany. There are cases where scientists, authors, and artists were sent abroad for apparently no other reason than that of their Jewish nationality. In some cases, these exiles were important contributors to the intellectual life of the Reich, and they were not in any way connected with either subversive movements or unpatriotic tendencies. Their expulsion is a sign of ignorance and senseless persecution on the part of the Nazis. But such bona fide cases were rare, and that statement is open to strict corroboration. Being a scientist or an author or a musician is not sufficient proof that a Jew was perfectly acceptable for the Nazi ideal of citizenship. A scientist can be completely wrapped up in his experiments and even suffer from a proverbial absent-mindedness, but at the same time, he can also be connected with some pacifist organization, even if his association is merely an honorary one. That would be enough to damn him in the eyes of Nazi officialdom, and an author could write 50 books of a harmless sort, but if one of that number happened to be of an obscene, unpatriotic, or pacifist tendency, the author would be taboo to the Nazis. On that point, it is extremely difficult to judge whether an intellectual Jew is expelled justly or unjustly. The foreigners, and particularly non-Nazis, are very far from being the best or most impartial judges. For, after all, the detailed activities of Jewish exiles before they left Germany is not known to the people living in London or New York. There is nothing in a name. Professor so-and-so of Berlin may be known to the world over his valuable contribution to the study of pituitary glands, and be honored by San Francisco scientists for his achievements, but at the same time, he may be connected with a communist or a pacifist organization in Berlin, and the world be none the wiser. The Nazis would disregard his invaluable services as an endocrinologist and concentrate on his political inclinations. And that, as I said before, is where Nazi officialdom made several bad mistakes, for which German science and art will eventually suffer, unless, of course, Aryan scientists and artists rise up to take the place of their Jewish counterparts who are now exiled. In the history of humanity's intellectual progress, there is no substantial proof that Aryans are any less capable than Jews of contributing towards the wealth of human knowledge. Germany for the Germans was the Nazis' cry, to which many replied, the Jews in Germany were Germans. They had lived in the Reich for generations. They adopted Germany's language and customs. They had full rights of citizenship, etc. Ergo, they were Germans. The same is said for Jews living in any other nation. Curiously enough, Jews themselves do not seem to share that view. Quote, Jews who pretend that they can be at once patriotic Englishmen and good Jews are simply living lies. End quote. That's from Mr. B. Feltz, a Jew, in the Jewish Chronicle. And we have another quote. Our union is not a French one, nor English, nor Swiss, nor German. Nay, our union is Jewish, and it is universal. Living in lands of dispersion, we cannot be concerned about the changing aims of these lands, which are strange to us. If you realize that in spite of your cover nationalities, you form only one and the same people, you will listen to our appeal and you will accept it. End quote. That's from Isaac Adolf Cremieux, Jewish founder of the Universal Jewish Alliance. We have a third quote. Here we are, just Jews and nothing else, a nation among nations. That's from Dr. Wiseman, a Jew in Great Britain, Palestine, and Jews. From these quotations, one cannot fail to understand that the Jews consider themselves a nation apart, and that, although they live in a country, they do not consider themselves anything more than citizens. The German Jew was a citizen, but not a patriot. The rise of nationalism in Germany was bound to bring out this fact very strongly, and thus add a further reason for Hitler's persecution of the Jews. The last word on the Jewish question remains to be written. The world is seeing the growth of a wave of anti-Semitism. Will it pass like so many others have done before now, leaving no trace before the destiny of the chosen people? Will it grow to enormous proportions, eventually forcing the Jews of the world back into their position of Middle Ages inferiority? On purely religious and moral grounds, it is difficult to conceive how the Christians and Jews will ever be able to live in the same country without fighting each other. The Jews would like to see Judaism as the reigning creed of the world, while Christians have no intention of returning to early Christian days of subordination, a repercussion of Count de Gobineau's dolichocephalic versus brachycephalic theory. Then what to do with 14 million Jews? The ideal solution would obviously be that the Jews should have a nation of their own, where they could develop their social, economic, and religious ideas without coming to grips with Christian civilization. In the last 20 years, the world has seen the growth of the Zionist movement, whose aim was to create a Jewish nation in Palestine. Max Nordau himself, a Jew, thought that within a radius of 100 miles of the Dead Sea, there was room for 200 million Jews, whereas there are said to be about 14 million in the whole world. The Jewish nation idea is basically sound, but the Palestine movement presents problems, not the least of which is the enmity of the Arabs. Again, there are hundreds of thousands of Jews who have acquired Western habits and Western civilization. Could they ever go back to the hot climate of the East and relapse into Oriental customs? It is quite probable that they could, but the process of transformation would be distinctly unpleasant during the first 2 generations. The ultimate fact remains that the Jewish question is causing a great deal of unrest in the world at the present time. Out of sympathy for the millions of good, hard-working, and decent Jews whom one meets everywhere, it is to be hoped that the problem will find an early solution. That's the end of that chapter. And of course, the Zionist question is still a problem today, with recent events in what's now Israel. So they did get their state, but a lot of them don't live in their state still. And they just use it as a place to flee to if they get accused of a crime. And the problem isn't that we're too westernized. It's a lot of their problems in Israel today stem from their Jewish beliefs that they're the chosen ones, and that's their land, and the Goyim are inferior and don't deserve property. So earlier in the chapter we were talking about how Judaism was like the main religion, but it really wasn't. It really wasn't that big for most of history, or at any point in history. It was just a small corner of the Roman Empire. Hello, Hernan. And before that, there's no evidence that it really existed at all. Herodotus lived in the region for about a decade, and he doesn't mention Jews anywhere in it, despite that there was supposedly a kingdom of Israel with a big temple. Just no historian ever mentioned it. Maybe they were all anti-Semitic, I don't know. Or maybe it just never existed and it was all made up after the fact. Stuff like King David and the first temple and Solomon and Moses and all these people. They're more mythological than they are historical, but in the context of establishing Israel, we treat them as historical, which doesn't really make any sense. And next chapter, chapter 8, Hitler and a few others. Who are you? Said the cat. I was going through taking pictures of all these pages, so I was skimming some of it, and this part made me laugh because the next sentence is just Adolf Hitler, so it sounds like it's Hitler answering the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland. And I just thought that was funny. But anyway, we'll continue reading. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the Third German Empire. The man who put Germany on the front page of newspapers and made the whole world sit up and take notice. 10 years ago, he was practically unknown. Today, he stands at the head of 65 million Germans and dictates terms to powerful nations. Adolf Hitler is a self-made man. Born in Braunau, a small Austrian village on the River Inn, on April 20th, 1890, his father was an official in the Austrian customs services, and the family belonged to the smaller middle class. In a few years, people will probably tell you that when little Adolf was born, a wise woman in the village took one look at him and prophesied that he would one day become Chancellor of Germany. These tales usually surround the birth of a self-made man. When Abraham Lincoln was born, so the story goes, some wise prophet told Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln that their son would become President of the United States, and he did. So people definitely tell stories about him, but not quite like that. That's a little more wholesome than you're used to hearing. One fact is certain. When Herr and Frau Hitler left their 15-year-old son Adolf to fend for himself, they never dreamed that he would one day become Germany's ruler. Nor did young Adolf have any thoughts in that direction as he left Braunau on the Inn and wandered off to Vienna to earn his living. For 5 years, he managed to scrape along by doing odd jobs and occasionally working as a bricklayer. It was an important period of his life because, although the Hitler belt had to be tightened frequently, it gave him a clear insight into the conditions of living of workers, and it gave him the right to say in his speeches, "Comrades, I am a brother workman." Perhaps that is why the word worker is included in the official title of the Nazi Party, NSDAP, stands for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler's life in Vienna was nothing but a hard and monotonous struggle against the proverbial wolf at the door. When there was no more work to be done in Vienna, Hitler moved to Munich, and there managed to make a living by selling his sketches and watercolors. Hitler is a capable artist, and one day the public will perhaps have the opportunity of seeing a Hitler art exhibition. 23-year-old Adolf selling aquarelles to earn his daily bread, while today there is not an artist in Germany who has not begged the privilege of sketching the Hitler profile. The war broke out while Hitler was in Munich. He enlisted as a volunteer, and during the next 4 years established a splendid war record. A few days before the armistice, he was in a gas attack, which robbed him of his sight for several months. For this reason, Hitler played no part in the 1918 revolution, after he was in hospital for a long time after the war. After his discharge, he was employed as a political lecturer to the soldiers, and it was during the course of this work that he first came into contact with the German Labor Party, composed of ex-servicemen of all classes. This party was the only one of many ex-servicemen organizations that were established after the war. The Stahlhelm, the Einwohnwehr, etc., whose aim was to fight the growth of communism and anarchy. From 1920 onwards, Hitler devoted his whole life to the newly created National Socialist German Labor Union, which was later to become the present-day Nazi Party. His biography from this point is the history of the Nazi movement. Now look at a photograph of Hitler and try to understand how this man managed to reach his present position. A round head and a round face, a strong chin under a thin-lipped, ruthless-looking mouth, and a Charlie Chaplin mustache, hair parted on the right with a Napoleonic lock straggling down over the left eye. No one could say that he looks typically German. If Hitler is to be called typically something, I'd say he looks like a respectable French bourgeois, and then that would be high treason. Nevertheless, Hermann Goering is the man for the typically Prussian face, not Hitler. His oratory is not German either. He talks like Mussolini, raising his voice to a shout and then dropping to a hoarse whisper, bangs his fist on the rostrum, shakes it at the sky, waves his arms, and tosses back his unruly lock of hair with the gesture of a musician. And the people love it. They were tired of the monotonous drone of the average German orator, the long, unending sentences constructed according to the rules of academic elocution. They wanted speeches that would warm the blood in their veins and make them forget their hunger. Short, snappy sentences that could be made into slogans and easily remembered. Speeches like those of the communists, but without the Bolshevist touch. The first time I heard Hitler speak in public, I spent 10 minutes repeating to myself, "What a comedian, what a comedian," as the Pope said to Napoleon many years ago. 20 minutes later, I felt like cheering. The passionate conviction, the fierce fire of invulnerable patriotism, and above all, the wholehearted sincerity put Hitler far above or far beyond the familiar little tricks of the mob orator. Every one of his words comes out charged with a powerful current of energy. At times it seems as if they are torn from the very heart of the man, causing him indescribable anguish. When he speaks of the fatherland, when he describes the sorry state of demoralization which had set in, his eyes flash with anger, his voice rises with a shriek of fury. He is inspired. That is what the masses believe, that Hitler is a prophet directly controlled by the powers above, and I can quite understand it. There is a magnetic fluid emanating from Hitler which seems supernatural. And there are groups of people that believe that Hitler was some kind of avatar or something like that, even today. The next time I saw Hitler was in the Kaiserhof Hotel in Berlin, where he is very fond of drinking tea in the afternoon. I watched him for a time to try and discover whether the fieriness of the platform was merely a mask adopted for the purpose of swaying the masses. I do not think so, for although he was chatting and occasionally laughing with his friends, I could see a smoldering fire in his eyes. Every atom of his body seemed imbued with a latent intensity, ready to well forth at any moment. For years now, Hitler has been acting as the source of energy for all his followers. In the darkest moments of the party's history, when it seemed that their goal would never be reached, he revived their jaded hopes by his own unquenchable enthusiasm. Time has proved that this enthusiasm was sincere. One can simulate sincerity on a platform for a time, but sooner or later somebody will see through the mask. Hitler has kept it up for over 12 years. In a way, he is not to be envied. The never-ceasing fire that burns within him prevents him from enjoying many of life's entertainments. He has neither the time nor the inclination for social activities, not even among intimate friends. He lives in the midst of many men, yet he lives alone. Spiritual loneliness must be Hitler's secret regret. When he can snatch a few moments' respite from his work, he drives away his fast Mercedes sports car to his Obersalzberg home, where he spends a few quiet hours with his spinster sister. She plays a very effaced role in his life. No publicity for Fraulein Hitler. Why does not some enterprising reporter take a large notebook to Obersalzberg and get an interview? Salzburg reminds me of the story of Hitler and the little girl. On one of his trips home, he stopped at a village for petrol. The little girl came up to the car and started talking to the driver, not knowing that it was the great Adolf Hitler himself. In the course of the conversation, it came out that day was the little girl's birthday, so Hitler took her in his car to the next town, gave her a sumptuous meal of cakes and sweets, and then brought her home laden with toys. Adolf does not smoke, and he never drinks alcohol. His great pleasure, when he can find time for it, is to go to the opera. Museums are his hobby. He claims to know the museums in Berlin better than anyone else. His early association with the building trade gave him a lasting interest in architecture, and it is said that the alterations made to the Braun House in Munich, the Nazi headquarters, originated from his own ideas. He is unmarried, of course, and so far no one has discovered any amour cachés, although at one time there was a rumor that he had been secretly married and divorced. His great failing, which is an obvious corollary to his intensity, is the lack of a sense of humor, but that is a fault shared by the majority of Germans. There have not yet been any bon mot by Hitler. Perhaps they will come later on, when the tension of the revolution has toned down. Hitler appeals to nearly all classes, but he is particularly loved by the middle class. This class was stagnating in a morass of increasing poverty and moral laxity, and in Hitler it has found someone to renew its hopes. Hitler is not only the leader, but he is the savior. He has saved the bourgeois from the dangers of communism, they say, and he has given work to 3 million men. He is fighting for the rehabilitation of Germany's equality among the nations of Europe. He has restored the self-respect of millions by fanning the flame of patriotism long dormant in their hearts. Heil Hitler. It is a form of adoration, hero worship, or what you will. The middle class and a large section of the working class talk of our Führer with the reverence accorded by Catholics to the Pope. Even Hitler's enemies talk of him with respect. Pick up a communist paper today. There are still a number of them printed abroad and smuggled into the country, and you will not find any lewd remarks about Hitler. Any number of obscene accusations against Goering, Frick, Röhm, and Goebbels, but nothing against Adolf Hitler that is a remarkable fact that deserves to be put on record. The hero worship complex is shown in the number of pictures of Hitler sold in Germany today. There is not a single bookseller or stationer who has not got his windows well stocked with photographs of the Führer. Hitler marching at the head of his stormtroops, Hitler laying the foundation stone of a building, Hitler patting the head of a child, Hitler on the balcony of his Salzburg home, etc. A word of praise to Herr Hoffmann, Hitler's official photographer. He is an artist who could be backed against America's hottest press agent, but even he could not make the public buy his pictures if they did not want them. The closing words of any panegyric on Hitler should be, he is a sincere patriot. No man, whatever his nationality, could wish for higher praise than that. Wow, he's a laborer, and he likes to go to the museum and read instead of party and do all this crazy stuff. Wow, he's literally me, guys. Wow. That's how a lot of people felt. I don't know. I'm kind of worried about the YouTube algorithm, picking up all this stuff about Jews and Heil Hitler and stuff, because it's just the robots. They're gonna get me. But we'll carry on anyway. I leave it to others to write of Hitler's rise to power, how he began with a handful of men in 1920, the struggles and the disappointments of those 12 years, and the ultimate success in 1933. The history of the Nazis' rise to power, culminating in the coup d'etat in February 1933, contains many instances of intrigues that could be severely criticized. How they used the support of the nationalists to reach their goal, and then double-cross them in the end. In the words of Joseph Goebbels, quote, "Genuine revolutionaries do not admit compromise. They cannot allow other gods to sit beside them. They must have complete power in order to carry out their ideas. That is why we destroyed the other parties. We cannot use them anymore. They stood in our way, the parties of the right as well as those of the left." End quote. And that's from his speech in Munich on November 9th, 1933. History is full of cases where the rise of new rulers would not bear too close an examination. Napoleon's coup d'etat in France, Richard III's summary way of dealing with young King Edward V, the rise of the Soviet Party in Russia, and so on. The question which humanity asks about any new leader is not, how did he come into power, but rather, what did he do when he got there? It has been said that a really great leader is one who knows how to choose his collaborators. In that, Hitler has undoubtedly shown real genius. Although some of the Nazi officials now in power are the usual opportunists and hangers-on who accompany every revolution, the men at the top are undoubtedly sincere patriots, for they have championed the National Socialist cause for at least 10 years. General Hermann Blood and Thunder Göring, the most hated man in Germany and the most slandered one outside of his own country. Prime Minister of Prussia, Minister of Air, President of the Reichstag, Hitler's personal representative in Berlin. Born in Rosenheim, Bavaria, on January 12, 1893, he is the typical child of Capricornus, headstrong, strong-willed to the point of ruthlessness, violently active, and inherently sensitive. Göring belongs to the upper class. His father was a Dr. Göring, entered the Karlsruhe Cadet Corps, and then graduated to a cadet school, received a lieutenant's commission in an infantry regiment in 1912. Göring was only 21 years old when the war broke out. He fought in the infantry for the first few months and then became an observer in the Air Force. In 1915, he had his own airplane, and a few months later became a Jagdflieger, a hunter in the air. As such, he is reported to have brought down a large number of Allies' planes. His record was so good that in 1918 he took command of the famous Baron von Richthofen Flight Battalion, which had lost its original leader. In 1922, Hermann studied in the University of Munich, and in December of that year, he became one of the first stormtroop commanders. He marched at the head of his men in Hitler's putsch of 1923 and was severely wounded. When the Nazi Party was disbanded by the government, and Hitler was put in prison, where he wrote his autobiography, My Battle, Göring escaped to Italy and later went to live in Sweden. In Stockholm, he fell in love with Baroness Karin Falk, a Swedish aristocrat of great beauty and talent. Göring was working on an airplane factory at the time and managed to make himself an excellent position. He married the Baroness, and those who know Hermann intimately will tell you that it was le grand amour, the passionate devotion that comes to a man once in a lifetime. Nowadays, we call that the one-itis, or so I've heard. That's what the kids say, anyway. Frau Goering unfortunately died in 1931, leaving Goering a broken man. One can imagine what his feelings were when, a year later, communists desecrated the grave of his wife. Tall, broad-shouldered, a square head and a square face, the high and broad brow shows intelligence. The long upper lip indicates the domineering side of his character, and the mouth is firm and finely formed. There is a peculiar trait about Goering's face. It never photographs the same twice. If you look at one hair, what an artist Hoffman's pictures, you will see Goering as the strong-jawed Prussian officer with, metaphorically, a sword in one hand and a whip in the other. Compare that with other photographs, and you will see a totally different Hermann, a man who appears to be emotional and artistic, with frank blue eyes and a sensitive mouth. Like your true Prussian, Hermann adores uniforms. The different government positions he holds allows him to wear a varied collection of resplendent regalia, not forgetting the glittering array of medals on his broad chest. Until recently, the Goering household included a baby leopard. Apart from eating the cushions and disemboweling the divans, the leopard was a charming pet until it began to cast carnivorous eyes on the servants and visitors. Now the Goering leopard is in the Berlin Zoo. General Goering is the man who did most of the dirty work during the Hitler Revolution. He is the man of action, the ex-officer who refuses to brook interference with his orders. The press outside Germany accused him of many things. He was a drug fiend, a madman, a barbarian. He fired the Reichstag, etc. Whether he was, at one time, a morphinomaniac is of small importance. Hitler chose him for his strength of character and his organizing ability. And so far, he has not disappointed the leader. He was given the task of completely reorganizing Germany's police to expurgate the corruption in the force. So far, he has done some excellent work. The only criticism one can make is that he is in danger of developing a superiority complex. If he begins to compete with Hitler for supremacy, it will cause a lot of trouble. Yeah, I mean, I would say he had a superiority complex, owning exotic animals, decorating himself in all these medals and stuff. He was a drug addict, at least towards the end of the war. I know in Goebbels' diaries he talks about it. I don't know if that was the whole time, but apparently he was shot in the stomach at one point and was in constant pain. So he was basically like a morphine addict or an opioid addict. Dr. Joseph Mickey Mouse Goebbels. I've never seen that nickname for him before, and I'll probably never see it again. But hopefully Disney doesn't come after this video. Maybe that's why the book got canceled. That might be it. I don't know. The youngest and one of the brainiest men around, Hitler, his nickname is a byword, Mickey Mouse, the Reich Minister of Propaganda. He plays an important part in the new Germany because of the fact that he controls all the forces which go to mold public opinion. The press, the cinema, the theater, the broadcasting stations, all are in the hands of Dr. Goebbels. Paul Joseph Goebbels was born in Rate in Rhine country on October 29th, 1897. His father had a small business, and his mother was the daughter of a blacksmith. Another man, aus dem Volk, handicapped by a club foot, Paul Joseph nevertheless showed himself to be a brilliant scholar and obtained the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in 1920. 2 years later, he attends one of Hitler's meetings in Munich and is overcome with the grandeur of the new idea. From that moment, he gives up his life to the Nazi cause and begins his active career by secretly organizing stormtroop divisions in the occupied territories of the Rhine. For this, he is expelled from the Ruhr and Rhine districts by the governing commission. Little daunted, Paul Joseph goes to Elberfeld and becomes editor of the Völkische Freiheit, after which his activities are mostly journalistic. In 1926, he starts a weekly paper called Der Angriff, which was later chosen to be the Nazi official organ. In 1928, he's elected to the Reichstag, and later Hitler appointed him district commissioner of Berlin, a position which he still holds with his ministerial portfolio. Goebbels was made Minister of Propaganda on March 13, 1933, during the Revolution. When you meet the small man with the club foot and the thin, ascetic face, the first thing that strikes you is his friendly smile. You then look at his eyes and cannot help seeing the fierce inward fire which he shares with Hitler. Also, the same magnetism and enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is the key to Goebbels' success. Despite his physical disabilities, he can sway a crowd with his words by instilling into them his own burning convictions. Commissioner of Berlin, editor of a daily newspaper, he has found time to write 4 novels, 2 plays, and countless pamphlets and articles. Goebbels has made nearly as many enemies as Goering. Authors and journalists who have been expelled from Germany by his orders express their resentment in books and articles published abroad. Here's an example of some particularly brilliant vituperation. Quote, "Every word he spoke became a deed. He shouted murder, and in thousands of towns throughout Germany, murder was committed. He screamed prison, and thousands of prison doors opened of themselves. He bellowed blood and tears were poured forth in endless streams. A cross between a gutter snipe and Napoleon. The mob sees only Napoleon. He is the life and soul of the party, laughing at his own effrontery, making fun of Fat Adolf, Mickey Mouse, the administrator of the German Empire." End quote. And that's from Dawn of Darkness by Balder Olden. In this book, one of the characters is Schneerwind, who is obviously meant to represent Dr. Goebbels. Incidentally, Herr Olden is a refugee. Frau Goebbels and her 2 charming children would be little frightened if they knew what a monster they were living with. Goebbels has been ruthless in his application of the National Socialist idea to the intellectual and entertainment spheres. But when one realizes to what depths of demoralization and pornography a large part of the press, theater, and cinema had fallen in 1932, one is inclined to be thankful that these powerful media of intellectual guidance have passed into the hand who is a sincere Christian and a true German patriot. After his first revolutionary excitement, Mickey Mouse will undoubtedly rebuild Germany's intellectual spheres on clean and wholesome lines. That's funny. These 3 men, Hitler, Goering, and Goebbels, are the only ones who are mostly in the news. The other prominent men in the new regime are equally important in their own way, but do not, as a rule, receive much publicity. Man, that Mickey Mouse and his German Revolution. So his own sort of transformation they talked about here, where he listened to a speech by Hitler, is kind of reproduced in his novel Michael, which I talked about last year in my banned book stream. With the character Michael going through his own nationalist transformation. The difference is that Michael became a laborer, and Goebbels was always just kind of a paper pusher, I guess. Although if you read his struggle in Berlin, it's pretty enlightening on the struggles that they went through. He wasn't just some guy sitting at a desk. He went out. He was leading marches and getting the shit beat out of him, just like the rest of them. So I definitely recommend his struggle in Berlin if you can find it. I think it's getting a new English translation either this year or next year. So I'm kind of looking forward to that because I would like to own a physical copy. All right. Dr. Wilhelm Frick. Plus royaliste que le roi. should be Dr. Frick's nickname. A stronger National Socialist than Hitler. 57 years old in 1933, Wilhelm Frick waged a solitary war against those forces which, in his opinion, were destroying Germany long before Hitler came into power. As Minister of the Interior in Thuringia in 1930, he made himself thoroughly unpopular by banning pornographic literature and films and combating the pro-abortion propaganda then at its height. He spent many years of his life in various police departments and is now Minister of the Interior. His hobby is race purity, and it is said that he was the strongest advocate of the sterilization law recently promulgated. One criticism against Wilhelm is that he has a tendency to be an extremist. The idea of National Socialism is a worthy one, but it must not be pushed too far. Victor Lutz. After the treachery of Ernst Röhm, Chief of Staff of Stormtroops, and his summary execution in June 1934, Hitler put Victor Lutz in command of the Stormtroops. Born in the Rhineland in 1889, Lutz lost an eye in the war, joined Hitler in 1922, was elected to the Reichstag in 1930. In 1933, he was appointed police president in Hanover, and shortly after became president of the Hanover province of Prussia. He is very intelligent, leads a life as sober and simple as that of Hitler, and his morals are above suspicion. Not even the German public knows very much about Victor Lutz, whose efficiency is only equaled by his modest reticence. Rudolf Hess, born 1896, is one of the most important and also one of the most pleasant men around Hitler. He is one of the Führer's adjutants, his private secretary, and his personal deputy. If anything happens to Hitler, Rudolf has authority to take over command, was a brilliant scholar, went through the war, and joined the Nazis in 1921, belongs to the brainy class of Nazi, and I predict a great future for this tall, athletic young man with a strong jaw and enormous eyebrows. He actually had probably the most tragic future out of all the people listed here. I mean, I don't really know anything about Victor Lutz or Frick, what ended up happening to them. But, Hess flew to Britain to negotiate peace. He was arrested. Spent the rest of his life in prison, isolated, for the crime of seeking out peace during the war. And then supposedly hanged himself in, I think, like 1989, when he was in his 90s, well into his 90s. So, I mean, I think he was murdered. A lot of other people think he was murdered. But really, I mean, the guy was trying to negotiate peace, and they just put a knife in his back. It's fucked up. Alfred Rosenberg, editor of the Völkische Beobachter, powerful Munich organ of the party. Despite his name, he is not a Jew. On the contrary, he has always distinguished himself as a violent anti-Semite. Alfred has hopes of creating a new Germanic religion, with presumably himself as high priest. He is the head of the so-called Foreign Affairs Bureau, a post for which he is eminently unsuited, as his English visit fiasco has shown. So I talked about him a little bit in my last banned book stream last year, because I was showing off my copy of his Myth of the 20th Century and talking about it. And he was pretty much executed for writing that book. Although it wasn't officially. I mean, they called him a war criminal, but what crime did he commit during the war? He was another one who was just a paper pusher. He didn't really do much of anything. Walter Funk, born in 1890, is well known in England and America for his books and lectures on economics. Joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and now holds the position of political and economic advisor to Hitler. Franz Schwarz, born in 1875, joined the Nazi Party in 1922, holds the party's cash box, being treasurer of the NSDAP. Baldur von Schirach, born in 1907, is the small boy of the party. His youth and his intelligence made Hitler choose him for the leadership of the various Nazi youth organizations, such as the Hitler Jugend. Handsome, idealistic, Baldur represents the spirit of youth that is beginning to make itself felt throughout the world. He will go a long way in the Third Empire, if he does not try to make himself too important and antagonize the older members of the party. Dr. Ernst Late Final Hanfstangl, I have kept him for the last so that the reader will finish the chapter with a good impression. Ernst is a German, with an American mother. She was née Sedgwick Hine and was related to General John Sedgwick, who fought in the Battle of Gettysburg during America's Civil War. He was educated at Harvard University and lived in New York for many years, where he managed a branch of his father's publishing business. Joined Hitler in 1922, since when the Fuhrer has had one of the world's finest press agents working for him. During the Revolution, Hanfstaengel's office was besieged every day by newspaper men. He kept the wires of the world humming and did quite a lot to further understanding between the New Germany and the English-speaking nations. Rumor wants it that America will soon see more of Putzi Hanfstaengel. That concludes the list of the most important Nazi officials now in power. As I said before, there are others who have obtained official positions on the strength of their loyalty to the party rather than on their own merits. Hitler is loyal to his old supporters and has given jobs to some of the pioneers, irrespective of their personal qualifications. It is to be hoped that they will eventually be pensioned off and the field left free for the really intelligent Hitlerites. At the moment, there is a small gang of pioneers who cannot see beyond the down with Marxism stage of National Socialism. They are responsible for creating discord in the party and hindering the work of the leaders. I know several really brilliant men, loyal believers in the Nazi cause, who are abstaining from taking any active part in the New Germany until these violent extremists are eliminated from the party. There's a footnote. A short time after I wrote this, a number of these extremists, led by Ernst Röhm, in league with ex-Chancellor Schleicher, attempted to overthrow Hitler. The revolt was efficiently suppressed. And I think that's referring to the infamous Night of Long Knives, which he mentioned a little bit briefly, but he didn't really go into it. No mention of Gregor Strasser here. And a lot of these people I haven't really heard of. And I've read, I mean, I'm not like a historian. I'm not super well read or anything on a lot of these things, but I've read a few books from the era. And, I haven't really heard of some of these people. I hadn't really heard of Lutz or Schwartz or Chirac or this last guy. So I don't know anything about them. But that's it for today. Like I said, a little bit shorter, but I have work, so it's expected during the week. So yeah, those were kind of interesting chapters. We got to learn about some of the main characters in the party, and we got to talk about Jews. Hopefully YouTube doesn't take the video down. But next week we'll talk about brown shirts. So I guess the Nazi party and the SA. I don't think the SS existed at this time, so it'll just be the SA, I expect. But thank you for being with me again today. Thank you, Hernan and Angela, and anyone who is lurking. And I'll be back tomorrow. We'll read a few more chapters, and we'll just keep doing that throughout the week until we're done. We're already over halfway through the book, so we're getting there. It's about 215 pages, I think, was the number. So, yeah, I'll see you all tomorrow. Same time. Bye.